Welcome, residents of South Park and beyond, to a journey into the depths of one of animation's most underestimated souls. Tonight, we explore the tragic beauty of Kenny McCormick, the boy who dies 1,000 deaths yet never stops caring. This is not just the story of a muffled voice behind an orange parka, but an examination of how true heroism emerges from the most unlikely circumstances. So settle into your bed, let the mountain air fill your lungs, and prepare to drift as we walk through the immortal tragedy of South Park's most resilient heart. Close your eyes and let's begin. In the mountain town of South Park, Colorado, where the extraordinary masquerades as mundane and death itself becomes a recurring punchline, there exists a mystery so profound that it touches the very fabric of reality itself. Kenneth McCormick's immortality is not the result of scientific experiment or superhero origin story, but something far more ancient and disturbing, rooted in the darkest corners of human spiritual practice and cosmic horror. To understand Kenny's curse, we must venture into the shadows of his earliest moments, when his parents, Stuart and Carol McCormick, made choices that would condemn their son to an existence of endless death and resurrection, though they were too intoxicated to comprehend the magnitude of their actions. The origins of Kenny's immortality lie buried in a period of his parents' lives that they remember only in fragments, hazy recollections filtered through alcohol and willful ignorance. 10 years before the events that would make Kenny a household name for his spectacular deaths, Stuart and Carol McCormick were regular attendees at what they believed to be harmless social gatherings, meetings of individuals who shared an interest in alternative spirituality and esoteric knowledge. These were not the suburban book clubs or casual philosophical discussions that their description might suggest, but rather gatherings of a cult devoted to the ancient cosmic entities that H.P. Lovecraft had glimpsed in his fiction, but that existed far beyond the boundaries of human imagination. The cult of Cthulhu that operated in the shadows of South Park during Kenny's infancy represented something far more dangerous than the typical religious extremism that occasionally surfaces in small communities. These were individuals who had discovered genuine pathways to otherworldly powers, who had learned to pierce the veil between dimensions and communicate with beings whose existence predated human civilization by eons. The meetings that Stuart and Carol attended with such casual regularity were not mere role-playing sessions or fantasy indulgence, but actual rituals designed to weaken the barriers between our reality and the sunken city of Relia, where ancient gods slumber and wait for their opportunity to reclaim dominion over Earth. The McCormick's participation in these gatherings was motivated by nothing more profound than their perpetual quest for free alcohol and social acceptance among a group that seemed to welcome anyone willing to show up consistently. Stuart and Carol had no understanding of the forces they were helping to unleash, no comprehension of the cosmic significance of the words they recited or the symbols they helped to inscribe. They attended these meetings in states of advanced intoxication, drawn by the promise of community and libation, rather than any genuine spiritual seeking or intellectual curiosity about the nature of reality itself. The ritual that would seal Kenny's fate took place during one of these gatherings, when the cult members had finally accumulated sufficient knowledge and spiritual energy to attempt something they had been building toward for months. The ceremony depicted in fragments throughout the Mysterian trilogy shows a group of hooded figures surrounding an infant, their hands raised in gestures that channel otherworldly power, while ancient words spill from their lips in languages that predate human speech. This was not a baptism in any traditional sense, but rather an offering, a sacrifice designed to create a permanent bridge between our world and the realm of the Great Old Ones. The baby at the center of this ritual was Kenny McCormick. Though his parents would never remember agreeing to his participation or even being present when the ceremony took place, the cult had learned to exploit Stuart and Carol's drinking habits timing their most significant rituals for moments when the McCormicks would be too intoxicated to form clear memories or make rational decisions about their infant son's welfare. In their altered state, Stuart and Carol likely believed they were simply attending another social gathering, unaware that their baby was being used as a focal point for forces that operated according to logic so alien that human minds could not properly comprehend their intentions or methods. The exact nature of what occurred during Kenny's ritual remains shrouded in mystery, but the evidence suggests two primary possibilities, each as disturbing as the other. The first theory proposes that the ceremony successfully summoned an entity from the sunken city, a being of such ancient power that its mere presence altered the fundamental nature of reality around Kenny's developing soul. This cosmic force may have recognized something valuable in the infant's spiritual essence, choosing to inhabit his body as a vessel through which it could experience human existence while remaining connected to its otherworldly origins. The second possibility is perhaps even more tragic in its implications. Rather than summoning a separate entity to possess Kenny, the ritual may have simply cursed him with a form of immortality that serves the cosmic entity's long-term purposes. Under this interpretation, Kenny's endless cycle of death and resurrection functions as a kind of spiritual battery, each traumatic death generating psychic energy that feeds the slumbering gods in their sunken city. His suffering becomes fuel for their dreams, his repeated resurrections ensuring a steady supply of the particular type of anguish that these entities require to maintain their connection to our dimensional plane. Regardless of which interpretation proves correct, the ritual's immediate effect was to fundamentally alter Kenny's relationship with death itself. From his earliest moments, Kenny existed in a state that transcended normal human limitations, while trapping him in a cycle of trauma that would define every aspect of his psychological development. The entity that inhabits him, or the curse that binds him, operates according to rules that supersede natural law, allowing him to return from death through means that bypass conventional resurrection while ensuring that he retains full memory of each traumatic experience. The mechanics of Kenny's resurrection process reveal the sophisticated nature of the forces that control his existence. When Kenny dies, his soul does not journey to any conventional afterlife or face judgment according to traditional religious frameworks. Instead, his consciousness is temporarily returned to the cosmic realm from which his curse originates, where it undergoes a process of renewal and restoration that prepares it for reinsertion into a new physical form. This explains why Kenny sometimes glimpses hell during his deaths, as his soul briefly passes through dimensional spaces that exist outside normal reality before being drawn back to Earth. The physical resurrection process itself demonstrates the ritual's ongoing influence over natural law within Kenny's vicinity. His mother Carol immediately goes into labor whenever Kenny dies, giving birth to a new infant Kenny, who then ages rapidly overnight to match his previous biological development. This accelerated growth suggests that time itself operates differently around Kenny, that the cosmic forces governing his existence can manipulate temporal flow to serve their purposes. The new body is not simply a replacement, but rather a continuation of the same essential being, carrying forward all memories and psychological development, while providing a fresh, physical vessel for the next phase of his eternal cycle. Kenny's awareness of his immortality represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of his curse. Unlike characters in fiction who forget their traumatic deaths or exist in states of blissful ignorance about their supernatural nature, Kenny retains perfect recall of every violent end he has experienced. He remembers the sensation of being crushed, burned, shot, dismembered, and destroyed in countless ways, Yet he must wake up each morning and continue his existence, as if these traumatic experiences were merely nightmares, rather than genuine memories of actual events he has endured. This perfect memory of repeated trauma creates psychological pressures that no human mind should be capable of withstanding. Kenny experiences death not as a single event to be processed and integrated into his worldview, but as an ongoing reality that could strike at any moment without warning or meaning. Each morning when he awakens in his bed, he must confront the knowledge that his apparent safety is illusory, that the forces controlling his existence will inevitably engineer another spectacular demise that will provide entertainment for observers while inflicting genuine suffering upon him. The isolation imposed by Kenny's curse extends far beyond the physical experience of death and resurrection. The cosmic forces that govern his immortality also ensure that other people remain unaware of his supernatural nature, their memories automatically adjusting to accommodate each new Kenny as if he had always existed in his current form. This means that Kenny alone carries the burden of knowing what has happened to him, unable to seek comfort or understanding from friends and family who literally cannot remember his previous deaths or acknowledge the trauma he has experienced. The psychological profile of someone living under Kenny's circumstances would typically include severe post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative episodes, and a complete breakdown of trust in the stability of reality itself. The fact that Kenny maintains not only his sanity, but his fundamental goodness and concern for others speaks to either supernatural intervention in his psychological development or a strength of character that transcends normal human limitations. His curse may have been designed to create suffering, but it has inadvertently created someone whose capacity for resilience and compassion exceeds anything that normal human development could produce. Kenny's early deaths, occurring at a rate of multiple times per season during the show's initial years, established patterns that would define his relationship with mortality throughout his development. These deaths were not random accidents, but rather orchestrated events that seemed to follow their own internal logic, as if the cosmic forces controlling Kenny's fate were experimenting with different methods of termination to study their psychological effects. The variety of his demises suggests a systematic approach to trauma induction, designed to ensure that no form of death becomes familiar or predictable enough to lose its psychological impact. The casual nature of Kenny's early deaths, treated as punchlines by both his friends and the show's narrative structure, reflects the cosmic entity's complete indifference to human suffering and their alien understanding of existence itself. From their perspective, Kenny's repeated deaths are not tragedies but rather data points in a vast experiment designed to harvest specific forms of psychic energy. The fact that other characters respond to his deaths with catchphrases and momentary concern before immediately forgetting the events suggests that the curse extends beyond Kenny himself to influence the perceptions and memories of everyone in his vicinity. The statistical analysis of Kenny's early deaths reveals patterns that support the theory of cosmic intervention in his fate. His deaths occur with mathematical precision, timing that suggests careful orchestration rather than random misfortune. The methods of his demise often involve unlikely coincidences, mechanical failures, or improbable accidents that stretch credibility beyond breaking point. These events happen with such consistency that they begin to resemble scheduled appointments rather than tragic mishaps, as if Kenny's death is built into the very fabric of reality around South Park. The psychological impact of this systematic destruction extends beyond Kenny to affect the entire community of South Park, though most residents remain unaware of their role in his ongoing trauma. The town itself becomes complicit in Kenny's suffering, its residents unconsciously participating in scenarios that lead to his demise, while remaining blissfully ignorant of their contributions to his endless cycle of death and resurrection. This community-wide amnesia serves the cosmic entity's purposes by ensuring that no one develops sufficient awareness of Kenny's situation to interfere with the ritual's ongoing effects. Kenny's immortality curse represents one of fiction's most sophisticated explorations of cosmic horror, demonstrating how ancient intelligences might manipulate human existence for purposes so alien that their victims cannot even comprehend the nature of their suffering. The ritual performed during his infancy created not just a single victim but an ongoing experiment in trauma and resilience that continues to generate the specific type of psychic energy required to maintain contact between dimensional planes. As we contemplate the magnitude of Kenny's curse and the circumstances that created it, we begin to understand that his immortality is both blessing and damnation, a supernatural gift that enables heroic acts while ensuring endless suffering. The cosmic forces that govern his existence care nothing for his individual welfare or happiness, viewing him merely as a tool to serve purposes that transcend human understanding. Yet in their alien indifference, they have inadvertently created something they did not anticipate: a human soul, capable of transcending the trauma they inflict, transforming their intended instrument of suffering into a beacon of compassion and self-sacrifice that shines all the brighter for the darkness from which it emerges. The architecture of poverty in South Park reveals itself most starkly in the McCormick family residence, a structure that stands as a monument to economic desperation and social abandonment, while the other homes in South Park maintain the cheerful uniformity of middle-class suburban comfort, with their neat lawns and well-maintained facades. The McCormick house exists as a visual reminder of what happens when the American dream fails to extend its promise to every family. The building itself tells the story of Kenny's childhood before he ever speaks a muffled word through his orange parka, its sagging roof and peeling paint serving as external manifestations of the internal decay that characterizes every aspect of the McCormick family dynamic. The physical deterioration of Kenny's home reflects decades of deferred maintenance that results not from laziness or indifference, but from the simple mathematical reality that survival takes precedence over aesthetics when resources are perpetually insufficient. The McCormick family operates in a state of constant triage, where each dollar must be allocated to immediate needs like food, utilities, and alcohol, leaving nothing for the kind of home improvements that their neighbors take for granted. The broken windows patched with cardboard, the front steps that sag under the weight of time and neglect, the yard that grows wild because lawnmowers are luxuries beyond their reach. All of these details combine to create an environment where Kenny learns from his earliest moments that his family exists outside the normal boundaries of middle-class comfort and security. The interior of the McCormick home reveals even more disturbing truths about the psychological environment in which Kenny's character was forged. The furniture consists primarily of cast-offs and salvage pieces that bear the wear of multiple previous owners, their springs poking through worn upholstery and their surfaces scarred by years of hard use. The appliances, when they function at all, represent technology from previous decades, second-hand purchases that break down frequently and require creative repairs that never quite restore them to full functionality. The television that serves as the family's primary source of entertainment is a small black and white model that receives only basic channels, limiting Kenny's exposure to the broader world, while his friends enjoy the latest programming on their modern color sets. The economic constraints that shape every aspect of Kenny's daily existence extend far beyond the physical environment of his home to encompass every interaction he has with the material world. His clothing consists entirely of hand-me-downs and thrift store purchases, garments that have been worn by other children before reaching him, and that will likely be passed down to his younger siblings when he outgrows them. The orange parka that becomes his signature garment is not a fashion choice, but rather the warmest winter coat that his family could afford. Purchased from a second-hand store and worn continuously because it represents their only protection against Colorado's harsh mountain winters. Kenny's relationship with food reveals another dimension of the poverty that defines his childhood experience. The McCormick family's meals consist primarily of whatever can be purchased cheaply in bulk and prepared with minimal cooking skills and equipment. Frozen waffles become a dietary staple not because of any nutritional value they provide, but because they are inexpensive, require no preparation beyond heating, and can satisfy hunger even when other food supplies run low. Kenny learns early that food is not something to be taken for granted, that meals are not guaranteed, and that hunger is a constant companion that must be managed rather than eliminated. The psychological impact of this food insecurity extends beyond simple physical discomfort to affect Kenny's understanding of his place in the social hierarchy of South Park Elementary. When his friends casually discuss restaurants their families frequent, vacation destinations they have visited, or toys they hope to receive for birthdays and holidays, Kenny must navigate the complex emotional terrain of wanting things that remain forever beyond his reach, while maintaining friendships with children who cannot comprehend the reality of his economic constraints. This creates a form of social isolation that goes beyond mere material deprivation to encompass a fundamental disconnect between his lived experience and that of his peers. Stuart and Carol McCormick, Kenny's parents, represent a particular type of American poverty that combines economic desperation with self-destructive behavior patterns that ensure their family's continued marginalization. Stuart's unemployment is not the result of economic downturns or industrial changes beyond his control, but rather the consequence of personal choices and character flaws that make him unemployable in any conventional sense. His drinking problem, his explosive temper, and his inability to maintain steady employment create a cycle of crisis that keeps the family trapped in poverty, even during periods when economic opportunities might be available to someone with different personal characteristics. Carol McCormick's response to their family's economic situation demonstrates how poverty can force individuals into choices that compromise their dignity and self-respect, while providing insufficient income to actually escape their circumstances. Her work in what the show euphemistically refers to as adult entertainment represents not a career choice made from empowerment or personal fulfillment, but rather the desperate decision of someone with limited options, who must generate income through whatever means are available to her. This choice creates additional psychological burdens for the entire family, as Kenny must navigate the social stigma associated with his mother's profession while dealing with the practical reality that this work provides their primary source of income. The addiction issues that plague both of Kenny's parents create an additional layer of economic drain that ensures their family's continued poverty, even when income might be sufficient to improve their living conditions. Stuart's alcoholism and Carol's various substance dependencies represent not moral failings, but rather coping mechanisms for individuals who lack the psychological resources to deal with the stress and hopelessness of their economic situation. However, these coping mechanisms consume financial resources that could otherwise be used for basic necessities, creating a vicious cycle where the behaviors that help them manage their poverty also ensure its continuation. The domestic violence that periodically erupts in the McCormick household reflects the psychological pressure cooker effect of poverty, combined with substance abuse and the grinding stress of economic insecurity. When Stuart's drinking escalates, or when financial pressures become particularly acute, the family's emotional tensions explode into physical conflict that traumatizes Kenny and his siblings, while providing no resolution to the underlying problems that created the crisis. These episodes teach Kenny that the adults in his life cannot be relied upon for protection or stability, that safety is temporary and violence is always a possibility lurking beneath the surface of family interactions. Kenny's relationship with his siblings in this environment of poverty and chaos reveals his early development of the protective instincts that will define his character throughout the series. Even as a young child, Kenny understands that his little sister Karen requires protection from the harsh realities of their family situation, and he works to shield her from the worst aspects of their parents' dysfunction, while providing what comfort and stability he can within the limitations of his own childhood powerlessness. This early assumption of adult responsibilities in a child's body creates psychological patterns that prepare Kenny for his later role as protector and guardian, though at a cost to his own emotional development and childhood innocence. The social dynamics at South Park Elementary reflect and amplify the economic disparities that define Kenny's home life, creating additional layers of isolation and stigma that reinforce his understanding of his place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. His friends, well-meaning though they may be, consistently demonstrate their inability to comprehend the reality of Kenny's economic situation through casual comments and assumptions that reveal the vast gulf between their lived experiences. When Cartman suggests that Kenny's mother might put a toy on layaway and make payments over time, the comment reveals not intentional cruelty, but rather a complete lack of understanding about what $8.95 represents to a family that struggles to meet basic survival needs. The gaming system disparity between Kenny's outdated ColecoVision and his friend's modern Nintendo represents more than simple technological differences, but rather fundamental questions about access to the cultural experiences that define childhood in late 20th century America. Kenny's exclusion from the shared gaming experiences that bond his friends together creates subtle but persistent forms of social isolation that compound over time as inside jokes, shared references, and common experiences accumulate into a body of cultural knowledge from which Kenny remains largely excluded due to his family's economic limitations. Kenny's academic performance at school reflects the complex interaction between innate intelligence and the environmental factors that either support or undermine educational achievement. Despite possessing natural intellectual gifts and curiosity about the world around him, Kenny's learning is consistently disrupted by the chaos of his home life. The distraction of hunger and discomfort, and the psychological burden of carrying adult responsibilities while still developing the cognitive and emotional tools necessary for academic success. His teachers, overwhelmed by their own professional challenges and lacking training in recognizing the signs of childhood poverty, often interpret Kenny's struggles as lack of motivation rather than environmental barriers to learning. The healthcare disparities that affect Kenny's family create additional dimensions of vulnerability that compound their economic struggles, while reflecting broader, systemic inequalities that trap families in cycles of poverty and poor health. The McCormick's lack of adequate health insurance means that medical care becomes a luxury rather than a basic necessity, leading to untreated conditions that worsen over time and create larger health crises that require more expensive emergency interventions. Kenny learns early that physical discomfort and illness are normal parts of life that must be endured rather than treated, creating psychological patterns of stoicism and self-reliance that serve him well in some contexts, but also prevent him from seeking help when assistance might be available. The transportation limitations that restrict Kenny's family's mobility create additional barriers to economic advancement and social participation that reinforce their isolation within South Park's community structure. Without reliable access to vehicles or public transportation, the McCormicks remain trapped within the geographical boundaries of their immediate neighborhood, unable to access employment opportunities, shopping alternatives, or social services that might be available in other parts of town. This geographical isolation compounds their economic isolation, creating a physical manifestation of their social marginalization that becomes self-perpetuating over time. Kenny's early exposure to adult themes and responsibilities through his parents' dysfunction and his family's economic desperation accelerates certain aspects of his psychological development while stunting others, creating the complex mixture of maturity and childlike vulnerability that characterizes his personality throughout the series. He learns to navigate adult problems and take responsibility for family crises, while still lacking the emotional and cognitive tools that healthy childhood development should provide. This premature exposure to adult concerns creates psychological resilience and practical problem-solving skills that serve him well in crisis situations, but also robs him of the carefree innocence that should characterize childhood experience. The shame that Kenny experiences as a result of his family's poverty and dysfunction creates psychological defense mechanisms that both protect him from emotional damage and limit his ability to form authentic connections with others. He learns to deflect attention from his family's problems through humor, self-deprecation, and careful management of information about his home life. This emotional self-protection serves important psychological functions, but also creates barriers to intimacy and authentic self-expression that persist throughout his development and affect his ability to form meaningful relationships with peers who cannot understand or relate to his experiences. The resilience that Kenny develops in response to his childhood poverty represents one of the most remarkable aspects of his character development, demonstrating how environmental adversity can create psychological strengths that might never emerge under more comfortable circumstances. His ability to find joy and meaning despite consistent hardship, his capacity to maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and his willingness to sacrifice for others even when he has so little to give. All of these qualities emerge from his early experiences with economic deprivation and family dysfunction. The poverty that could have broken his spirit instead forges it into something remarkably strong and compassionate, though at tremendous personal cost. The economic realities of Kenny's childhood create the foundation for understanding his later development as a character who consistently chooses to help others despite having every reason to focus exclusively on his own survival and advancement. The empathy he develops for those who suffer, the protective instincts he cultivates toward the vulnerable, and the heroic choices he makes throughout the series all trace their origins to the poverty prison of his early years, where he learned that dignity and worth are not determined by material possessions, and that true strength emerges from the ability to maintain one's humanity in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. The orange parka that envelops Kenny McCormick serves as both his most recognizable feature and his most profound barrier to human connection, a garment that transforms him from a distinct individual into a walking symbol whose humanity remains perpetually obscured. This heavy winter coat, purchased secondhand from necessity rather than fashion preference, becomes the defining element of Kenny's identity, while simultaneously erasing that identity behind layers of fabric and fur that muffle his voice and hide his face from the world. The parka represents one of fiction's most sophisticated explorations of how physical barriers can become psychological prisons, creating isolation that persists even when the individual desperately seeks connection and understanding. The practical origins of Kenny's parka lie in the economic realities of his family's situation and Colorado's harsh mountain winters. where adequate protection from the elements becomes a matter of survival rather than style. The McCormick family's limited resources meant that when Kenny needed winter clothing, his parents purchased the warmest coat they could afford from whatever second-hand options were available, regardless of how the garment might affect his appearance or social interactions. The orange color and excessive bulk of the coat mark it as outdated and unfashionable, even by the modest standards of South Park Elementary. But these aesthetic concerns become irrelevant when weighed against the coat's primary function of keeping Kenny alive through sub-zero temperatures. The hood of Kenny's parka creates the most significant barrier to communication, pulled tightly around his face in a configuration that reduces his features to barely visible eyes, peering out from a tunnel of synthetic fur and fabric. This hood becomes both protection and prison, shielding Kenny's face from wind and cold while creating an acoustic barrier that transforms his speech into indecipherable mumbles that sound like alien language to most listeners. The psychological impact of this constant obscurity cannot be overstated, as Kenny experiences every social interaction through the filter of fabric that literally comes between him and the world around him. The muffling effect of Kenny's parka creates a form of selective mutism that has nothing to do with psychological trauma or social anxiety, and everything to do with the simple physics of sound transmission through multiple layers of material. When Kenny speaks, his words must travel through the fabric of his hood, around the synthetic fur that frames his face, and past the drawstrings that cinch the opening closed, creating an acoustic pathway so complex that even the most carefully articulated speech becomes unintelligible by the time it reaches other people's ears. This transformation of clear thoughts into garbled sounds creates a cruel irony, where Kenny's intelligence and emotional depth remain hidden behind a barrier that exists purely by accident of economic circumstance. The content of Kenny's muffled speech reveals remarkable depth and sophistication when decoded by careful listeners or revealed through the show's occasional subtitles, demonstrating that his communication difficulties stem from external barriers rather than internal limitations. His comments often display keen insight into the situations unfolding around him, sophisticated understanding of complex social dynamics, and emotional responses that reveal genuine empathy and concern for others. The tragedy lies not in Kenny's inability to formulate intelligent thoughts or meaningful responses, but in the fact that these thoughts and responses remain trapped behind fabric barriers that render them incomprehensible to the people who most need to hear them. The few characters who demonstrate ability to understand Kenny's muffled speech represent breakthrough moments that reveal both the possibility of genuine communication and the rarity of individuals willing to invest the effort required to decode his words. Kelly, the environmental activist from the rainforest episode, becomes one of the first people to acknowledge Kenny's speech impediment directly, while making genuine efforts to understand what he is trying to communicate. Her willingness to listen carefully and respond to Kenny's actual words rather than dismissing them as meaningless. Noise creates a foundation for authentic connection that stands in stark contrast to the superficial interactions Kenny experiences with most other characters. The psychological impact of being consistently misunderstood extends far beyond simple frustration to encompass fundamental questions about Kenny's worth as a person and his ability to participate meaningfully in human relationships. When every attempt at communication results in confusion, dismissal, or comic misinterpretation, Kenny learns that his thoughts and feelings matter less than those of people who can express themselves clearly. This creates internalized patterns of self-doubt and social withdrawal that compound the external barriers created by his parka, making him less likely to attempt communication, even in situations where understanding might be possible. The rare occasions when Kenny removes his hood become moments of profound symbolic significance, representing not just physical exposure, but emotional vulnerability and authentic self-revelation. The South Park movie's climactic scene, where Kenny removes his hood before ascending to heaven, marks the first time viewers see his complete face clearly, creating a moment of visual intimacy that has been denied throughout the entire series. This unveiling occurs at the moment of Kenny's ultimate sacrifice, suggesting that authentic self-revelation and heroic action become possible only when the barriers that normally separate him from others are finally removed. The contrast between Kenny's muffled speech in his normal Parker-wearing state and his clear articulation when speaking, as Mysterion reveals the artificial nature of his communication barriers and the profound difference between his hidden and expressed selves. As Mysterion, Kenny speaks with clarity, authority, and emotional depth that demonstrate his capacity for meaningful communication when freed from the physical constraints of his everyday identity. This dual existence creates a poignant commentary on how external circumstances can mask internal reality, showing that Kenny's apparent limitations are environmental rather than inherent. The relationship between Kenny's Parker and his social invisibility operates on multiple levels, creating both physical and metaphorical barriers that keep him perpetually on the margins of group interactions. The coat's bulk makes him less physically agile than his friends, limiting his participation in activities that require quick movement or athletic skill. The hood's design restricts his peripheral vision, making him less aware of social cues and non-verbal communication that might help him navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. Most significantly, the overall effect of the Parker transforms Kenny from an individual person into a somewhat generic figure whose personality remains hidden behind layers of fabric and synthetic materials. The acoustic properties of Kenny's Parker create different levels of intelligibility depending on the emotional intensity and volume of his speech, suggesting that strong feelings can sometimes overcome the physical barriers that normally prevent clear communication. During moments of extreme excitement, anger, or distress, Kenny's voice occasionally breaks through the muffling effect clearly enough for other characters to understand specific words or phrases. These breakthrough moments often occur during crises or emotionally charged situations, creating ironic scenarios where Kenny's most important communications become audible only when circumstances are too chaotic for others to respond appropriately. The visual symbolism of Kenny's Parker extends beyond simple concealment to encompass broader themes about identity, authenticity, and the masks that people wear to navigate social relationships. The coat functions as both literal and metaphorical armor, protecting Kenny from physical and emotional exposure while preventing others from seeing and responding to his true self. This dual function creates complex psychological dynamics, where Kenny simultaneously seeks and fears genuine connection, understanding that authentic relationships would require him to remove the barriers that have become integral to his identity and survival strategy. The seasonal inappropriateness of Kenny wearing his heavy winter parka year-round reveals additional layers of psychological and practical significance that go beyond simple fashion choices or economic constraints. The coat represents security and consistency in a life otherwise characterized by chaos and unpredictability, becoming a form of psychological armor that Kenny cannot afford to remove, even when weather conditions no longer require such heavy protection. This attachment to his parka suggests that the barriers it creates, despite their obvious disadvantages, serve important psychological functions that Kenny is reluctant to abandon. The way other characters respond to Kenny's muffled speech reveals their own psychological limitations and social assumptions about communication, intelligence, and social worth. Rather than making genuine efforts to understand what Kenny is trying to say, most characters treat his muffled words as background noise or comic relief, dismissing his contributions to conversations without considering that meaningful content might be hidden behind the acoustic barriers. This collective failure of empathy and effort creates a community-wide pattern of exclusion that reinforces Kenny's isolation while reflecting broader social tendencies to marginalize individuals whose communication styles differ from accepted norms. The technology gap between Kenny's low-tech communication challenges and the digital communication tools available to his peers creates additional layers of exclusion that compound his existing barriers to social participation. While his friends can communicate through video games, social media, and other digital platforms that bypass physical speech altogether, Kenny's lack of access to these technologies leaves him dependent on face-to-face verbal communication that his Parker renders ineffective. This technological divide creates new forms of social isolation that build upon the existing barriers created by his physical appearance and economic circumstances. The therapeutic potential of removing Kenny's communication barriers remains largely unexplored within the show's narrative structure, but occasional glimpses suggest that addressing his muffling issues could dramatically improve his social integration and psychological well-being. The clear speech he demonstrates as Mysterion proves that he possesses normal vocal capabilities when not constrained by his Parker, suggesting that relatively simple interventions could restore his ability to communicate effectively with others. However, the complex psychological attachment Kenny has developed to his Parker-wearing identity makes such changes emotionally challenging, even when they might be practically beneficial. The linguistic analysis of Kenny's muffled speech reveals sophisticated vocabulary and grammatical structures that indicate advanced intellectual development despite his apparent communication limitations. When his words can be decoded, they often demonstrate understanding of complex social situations, emotional nuance, and abstract concepts that surpass the intellectual development typically expected from children his age. This disconnect between his apparent limitations and actual capabilities creates tragic irony where Kenny's intelligence remains hidden behind barriers that prevent others from recognizing and responding to his intellectual gifts. The cultural significance of Kenny's muffled voice extends beyond individual character development to encompass broader commentary about social exclusion, economic inequality, and the ways that environmental circumstances can create barriers to human connection that persist long after their original practical purposes have been served. His Parker becomes a symbol for all the ways that poverty, circumstance, and social assumptions can create artificial barriers between individuals who might otherwise form meaningful relationships and mutual understanding. The evolution of Kenny's relationship with his own voice and identity throughout the series reflects broader themes about self-acceptance, authentic communication, and the courage required to reveal oneself fully to others. As Kenny grows more comfortable with his heroic identity as Mysterion and develops greater confidence in his worth as a person, his willingness to speak clearly and reveal his true self increases correspondingly. This character development suggests that overcoming communication barriers requires not just addressing external obstacles, but also developing internal confidence and self-worth that make authentic self-expression feel safe and worthwhile. The tragedy of Kenny's muffled voice lies not just in the practical difficulties it creates, but in the profound human connections that remain unmade because of communication barriers that could be overcome with sufficient effort and understanding from both sides. Behind the orange Parker lives a person of remarkable depth, intelligence, and emotional capacity whose contributions to his community remain largely unrecognized, because the simple act of being heard and understood has become an insurmountable challenge in his daily life. In the grand tapestry of heroism that weaves through human storytelling, few patterns emerge as consistently as the transformation of personal suffering into compassionate action. Yet nowhere is this alchemy more powerfully demonstrated than in the extraordinary life of Kenny McCormick. His journey from victim to protector, from the recipient of cosmic cruelty to the guardian of others' well-being, represents one of fiction's most profound explorations of how genuine heroism emerges not from strength or privilege, but from the decision to transform one's own pain into protection for those who cannot protect themselves. Kenny's sacrificial heart beats with a rhythm established through countless deaths and resurrections, each traumatic experience adding another layer to his understanding of suffering, while strengthening his resolve to prevent others from enduring similar pain. The foundational moment of Kenny's heroic development occurs in South Park. Bigger, longer, and uncut, where his journey into the afterlife provides the narrative framework for understanding his fundamental character and the cosmic significance of his repeated sacrifices. When Kenny attempts to recreate the pyrotechnics from the Terrence and Phillip movie Asses of Fire and accidentally sets himself ablaze, his death serves as more than comedic punchline or plot device, but rather as the catalyst for a story that will test every character's moral boundaries and reveal the true nature of good and evil in the South Park universe. His descent into hell following this death marks the beginning of his most explicit heroic journey, where his actions will literally determine the fate of the world. Kenny's experience in hell during the movie reveals depths of empathy and emotional intelligence that his earthly existence had only hinted at through his muffled communications and seemingly passive participation in his friends' adventures. Confronted with Satan's abusive relationship with Saddam Hussein, Kenny does not respond with the cynicism or self-interest that might be expected from someone who has experienced so much personal trauma. Instead, he recognizes another soul in pain and chooses to offer support and guidance, demonstrating remarkable emotional maturity for someone whose own suffering has been so consistently dismissed and forgotten by those around him. The psychological complexity of Kenny's decision to counsel Satan through his relationship difficulties cannot be understated, as it represents a complete inversion of traditional power dynamics and moral expectations. Here is a child who has died countless deaths, experienced endless trauma, and received minimal support or recognition from his community. Yet when confronted with the supreme embodiment of evil in a moment of vulnerability, Kenny chooses compassion over revenge and understanding over condemnation. His advice to Satan about leaving his abusive relationship demonstrates sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse, knowledge that Kenny has likely acquired through witnessing the dysfunction in his own family, while developing the wisdom to recognize similar patterns in others. The climactic moment of Kenny's ultimate sacrifice in the movie establishes the template for all his future heroic actions, as he willingly accepts his own permanent damnation to save his friends and preserve the world from demonic conquest. When Satan grants him a single wish as reward for his emotional support and guidance, Kenny faces a choice that will define his character for the remainder of the series. He could wish for his own salvation, for escape from the eternal torture that awaits him in hell, for reunion with his friends, or for any number of personal benefits that would be entirely justified given his circumstances. Instead, Kenny chooses to wish that everything would return to how it was before Satan came to Earth, a decision that saves everyone while condemning himself to return to hell forever. The theological implications of Kenny's sacrifice resonate with centuries of religious tradition, while subverting expectations about innocence, suffering, and redemption in ways that elevate the story beyond simple comedy into genuine spiritual allegory. Kenny becomes a Christ-like figure who takes upon himself the sins and consequences of others' actions, suffering eternal punishment, so that those he loves can continue living in bliss and ignorance of the cosmic forces that threaten their existence. His willingness to accept this fate without complaint or expectation of recognition demonstrates a form of selfless love that transcends normal human emotional responses and approaches the divine in its purity and completeness. The rainforest expedition that introduces Kelly into Kenny's life provides another crucial example of his instinctive heroism and willingness to sacrifice his safety for others' protection, establishing patterns of behavior that will persist throughout his character development. When the Environmental Choir's mission to save the rainforest turns into a dangerous adventure filled with revolutionary forces, deadly wildlife, and natural disasters, Kenny consistently positions himself between danger and those who cannot protect themselves. His decision to jump in front of Kelly to shield her from gunfire demonstrates reflexive heroism that operates faster than conscious thought, suggesting that self-sacrifice has become so integral to his nature that he responds to threats against others with automatic protective behavior. The emotional significance of Kenny's relationship with Kelly extends beyond romantic attraction to encompass his desperate need for genuine human connection and recognition of his worth as a person deserving of love and consideration. When Kelly acknowledges his muffled speech and makes genuine efforts to understand what he is trying to communicate, she validates his humanity in ways that his friends and family have consistently failed to provide. This recognition creates a foundation of trust and emotional intimacy that enables Kenny to reveal his heroic nature more fully as he finally encounters someone who sees him as worth protecting and cherishing rather than simply tolerating or ignoring. Kelly's decision to attempt CPR when Kenny appears to die from the falling tree branch represents the first time in the series that someone treats Kenny's death as a genuine tragedy requiring immediate action rather than a punchline deserving only momentary acknowledgement. Her refusal to accept his death as permanent or inevitable challenges the cosmic forces that govern his existence while demonstrating the power of human love and determination to overcome supernatural constraints. The success of her revival efforts suggests that Kenny's curse can be overcome through genuine care and emotional connection, offering hope that his cycle of death and resurrection might be broken through sufficient love and understanding from others. The Mysterian trilogy reveals the full scope of Kenny's heroic development as his superhero persona provides him with the voice and agency necessary to act on his protective instincts without the barriers that normally limit his effectiveness. As Mysterian, Kenny can speak clearly and be heard, wear a costume that conceals his identity while revealing his true nature, and operate with the authority and respect that his civilian identity has been denied. The creation of Mysterian represents Kenny's conscious decision to transform his supernatural curse into a tool for helping others, using his immortality as a tactical advantage that allows him to take risks and make sacrifices that would be impossible for mortal heroes. The philosophical foundation of Kenny's heroic identity as Mysterian reflects sophisticated understanding of moral responsibility and the proper use of extraordinary abilities in service of others' welfare. Unlike Cartman's The Coon persona, which seeks glory and recognition, or the other children's superhero games that focus on fun and fantasy fulfillment, Mysterian operates from genuine concern for his community's safety and well-being. His patrol activities, investigation of criminal behavior, and intervention in dangerous situations demonstrate systematic commitment to protecting others that goes far beyond childhood role-playing to encompass actual heroic service. Kenny's investigation into his own origins during the Cthulhu trilogy demonstrates how his heroic nature extends to seeking truth and understanding, even when such knowledge might prove personally devastating or dangerous. His willingness to confront cosmic forces that dwarf human comprehension, to challenge entities whose power extends across dimensions and throughout time, reflects courage that transcends physical bravery to encompass intellectual and spiritual fearlessness. Even when faced with the possibility that his existence serves malevolent purposes or that his suffering feeds ancient evils, Kenny continues seeking answers and working to protect others from similar fates. The heaven versus hell conflict that draws Kenny into cosmic warfare during the PSP episode reveals how his heroic nature operates even when he lacks full understanding of the forces that manipulate his existence. When recruited by God to serve as tactician in the battle against darkness, Kenny accepts this responsibility without question or negotiation, understanding instinctively that his unique abilities and perspective make him valuable in ways that transcend his earthly limitations. His frustration at being trapped in a vegetative state while heaven needs his assistance demonstrates how deeply his identity has become connected to serving others and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The tragic irony of Kenny's situation during the Terry Schiavo parody storyline reflects broader themes about how society treats individuals whose worth is not immediately apparent or whose contributions go unrecognized by those with power and influence. While Kenny should be fighting cosmic battles that will determine the fate of all existence, he instead becomes a prop in political theater, where his actual wishes and well-being matter less than the ideological positions of those who claim to speak for him. This situation mirrors Kenny's broader experience of being overlooked and undervalued by those who should recognize his importance and protect his interests. Kenny's development of his Mysterian persona as a tool for helping his sister Karen demonstrates how his heroic nature adapts to address the specific needs of those he loves most deeply. Rather than simply using his powers for general crime fighting or community protection, Kenny recognizes that Karen's vulnerability requires specialized attention and intervention that only someone with his unique abilities can provide. His willingness to reveal his heroic identity to Karen while maintaining his secret from everyone else reflects sophisticated understanding of trust, responsibility, and the different levels of protection that different situations require. The emotional complexity of Kenny's relationship with heroism encompasses both the satisfaction of using his abilities to help others and the isolation that comes from bearing responsibilities that others cannot understand or share. His immortality enables acts of courage and self-sacrifice that would be impossible for normal individuals, but it also separates him from the common human experience of mortality and creates psychological burdens that no one else can truly comprehend. This isolation within his heroic identity reflects broader themes about the costs of extraordinary abilities and the loneliness that often accompanies great responsibility. Kenny's pattern of intervention during South Park's various crises reveals his evolution from reactive victim to proactive protector, as he learns to anticipate dangers and position himself to prevent harm rather than simply responding to threats after they have already caused damage. Whether protecting roosters from exploitation in underground gaming tournaments, helping his family during gentrification crises, or working with adults like Mr. Mackey to address community-wide problems, Kenny demonstrates increasing sophistication in his heroic strategies and greater confidence in his ability to make meaningful differences in others' lives. The theological dimensions of Kenny's heroic nature raise profound questions about the relationship between suffering and goodness, between personal trauma and capacity for compassion. Traditional religious narratives suggest that suffering can purify souls and create spiritual wisdom, but Kenny's example demonstrates how this transformation requires conscious choice rather than automatic development. His decision to respond to his own pain by preventing others from experiencing similar suffering represents a moral choice of the highest order, one that transcends his circumstances to create genuine virtue from authentic compassion. The community impact of Kenny's heroic actions extends far beyond the immediate benefits of his interventions to encompass broader effects on South Park's social fabric and moral atmosphere. His willingness to sacrifice for others creates ripple effects that influence how other characters understand their own responsibilities and possibilities, inspiring acts of courage and compassion that might not otherwise occur. Even when his specific contributions go unrecognized or forgotten, the cumulative effect of his heroic presence elevates the moral tone of his community and creates possibilities for goodness that extend beyond his individual actions. Kenny's heroic development represents one of fiction's most sophisticated explorations of how authentic virtue emerges from the conscious decision to transform personal suffering into protection for others. His sacrificial heart beats with rhythms established through trauma but animated by love, creating a hero whose greatness lies not in his supernatural abilities but in his unwavering commitment to using those abilities in service of others' welfare. In the quiet moments between crises, when the world sleeps safely because someone stands guard in the darkness, Kenny's heroism reveals itself not through grand gestures but through the simple decision to continue caring for others, despite having every reason to focus solely on his own survival and healing. In the constellation of relationships that define Kenny McCormick's emotional universe, no bond shines as purely or as powerfully as the connection he shares with his younger sister Karen, a relationship that transforms his supernatural curse from mere personal tragedy into purposeful mission, and his capacity for self-sacrifice from abstract virtue into concrete protective action. Karen McCormick enters Kenny's world as living proof that innocence still exists within the chaos of their dysfunctional family, a small light that requires protection from the darkness that seems to consume everything else in the McCormick household. Through his devotion to Karen's well-being and happiness, Kenny discovers that his immortality serves purposes beyond cosmic entertainment or divine punishment, becoming instead a tool that enables him to serve as guardian angel to someone who desperately needs protection from forces she is too young and vulnerable to understand or resist. Karen's introduction into the South Park universe occurs during moments when Kenny's heroic nature requires its most delicate and sophisticated expression, as protecting a child demands different skills than saving the world from supernatural threats or intervening in adult conflicts. Unlike the dramatic battles against cosmic evil, or the elaborate schemes to protect his friends from their own poor decisions, Kenny's guardianship of Karen operates through subtle interventions and quiet support that address the specific psychological needs of a young girl growing up in an environment characterized by poverty, addiction, and emotional neglect. Her vulnerability becomes the focal point for Kenny's most refined, heroic instincts, requiring him to develop new forms of courage that emphasize emotional support and psychological protection, rather than physical intervention or dramatic sacrifice. The foster care crisis that threatens to separate Kenny from Karen during the Poor Kid episode reveals the full depth of his commitment to her welfare and his willingness to use every resource at his disposal, including his secret identity as Mysterion, to ensure her safety and emotional stability. When their parents are arrested and the McCormick children are placed in foster care, Karen's distress becomes Kenny's primary concern, superseding his own fears about separation from familiar environments or his anxiety about living with strangers. Her inability to understand why their family has been torn apart, why they cannot return home, and why the adults in their lives seem incapable of providing consistent care creates psychological wounds that Kenny recognizes as deeper and more lasting than any physical harm she might suffer. The genius of Kenny's decision to visit Karen as Mysterion during her foster care placement lies in his recognition that she needs comfort and reassurance from a source that exists outside the failed systems of family and social services that have disappointed her so consistently. By appearing as a mysterious but benevolent protector, rather than revealing himself as her brother, Kenny creates a relationship dynamic that bypasses the complicated emotions and power imbalances that characterize their family connections. Mysterion becomes a figure of pure protection and support, someone whose only agenda is Karen's well-being, and whose presence represents hope rather than the burden of family loyalty or obligation. The conversations between Mysterion and Karen during her moments of greatest distress reveal Kenny's sophisticated understanding of child psychology and his intuitive grasp of what children need to feel safe and valued in an uncertain world. When Karen expresses her loneliness and fear about her future, Mysterion responds not with false reassurances or simple platitudes, but with acknowledgement of her feelings and promises of continued protection that he has the power to keep. His assurance that she is not alone, that someone will always be watching over her, provides the kind of unconditional support that every child deserves, but that Karen has never received from the adults in her life who should have been providing such security. The emotional complexity of Kenny's relationship with Karen as both brother and secret guardian creates psychological tensions that reflect broader themes about identity, responsibility, and the costs of heroic service. As Kenny, he must maintain the ordinary sibling relationship that provides Karen with family connection and shared experience of their difficult circumstances. As Mysterion, he must conceal his identity while providing protection and support that transcends normal family dynamics. This dual existence requires constant emotional compartmentalization and strategic thinking about how to meet Karen's needs through both personas without revealing the connection between them or compromising either relationship. Kenny's willingness to use violence to protect Karen from bullies and threats demonstrates how his heroic nature adapts to address different types of dangers, showing sophisticated understanding of when physical intervention becomes necessary to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Unlike his interventions in cosmic conflicts or community crises, where violence often serves dramatic or comedic purposes, Kenny's physical protection of Karen operates from pure parental instinct and brotherly love. His confrontations with her tormentors are swift, decisive, and designed to send clear messages about the consequences of targeting someone under his protection, establishing boundaries that potential threats understand and respect. The psychological impact of having Mysterion as her guardian angel transforms Karen's experience of childhood trauma and family dysfunction, providing her with a source of hope and protection that exists independently of the adults who have failed her so consistently. While she cannot understand the supernatural elements of her protection, or recognize that her mysterious guardian is actually her brother, Karen develops confidence and resilience that would be impossible without the knowledge that someone powerful and caring is watching over her. This transformation demonstrates how genuine protection and support can heal psychological wounds, even when the person providing that support cannot reveal their identity or receive recognition for their sacrifices. Kenny's decision to reveal his Mysterion identity to Karen, while keeping it secret from everyone else, reflects his recognition that their relationship requires a level of trust and intimacy that his other connections cannot accommodate. By sharing this crucial aspect of his identity with Karen alone, Kenny creates a special bond that transcends their sibling relationship, while acknowledging her right to know that her protection comes from someone who loves her rather than from random chance or supernatural intervention. This selective revelation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of emotional boundaries and the different levels of trust that different relationships can support. The domestic violence and chaos that characterize the McCormick household create ongoing threats to Karen's physical and emotional safety that require Kenny's constant vigilance and intervention, transforming his role from occasional protector to full-time guardian. Unlike the episodic crises that define his other heroic activities, Kenny's protection of Karen operates as continuous background responsibility that influences every decision he makes about risk-taking, resource allocation, and time management. Her presence in his life creates accountability that extends beyond his own survival or entertainment to encompass genuine responsibility for another person's well-being and development. Kenny's ability to provide emotional support and psychological comfort to Karen through his Mysterian persona reveals depths of emotional intelligence and therapeutic instinct that his muffled communications and apparent passivity normally conceal from other characters. His conversations with Karen demonstrate sophisticated understanding of trauma, loss, and childhood development, as he addresses her fears and insecurities with wisdom that seems to emerge from his own experiences with suffering, while being refined by his determination to spare her similar pain. These interactions showcase Kenny's capacity for nurturing and guidance that his other relationships have never allowed him to express fully. The economic dimensions of Kenny's protection of Karen reflect his growing understanding of how poverty creates vulnerability and his determination to shield her from the worst consequences of their family's financial struggles. Whether through his work at City Walk during the gentrification crisis or his various money-making schemes throughout the series, Kenny consistently prioritizes Karen's needs over his own desires, ensuring that she has access to necessities and small comforts even when resources are scarce. This economic protection requires him to make adult decisions about resource allocation and financial planning, while still maintaining his childhood relationships and responsibilities. The educational and developmental aspects of Kenny's guardianship of Karen demonstrate his recognition that true protection extends beyond immediate safety to encompass long-term preparation for independence and success in life. Through both his direct interactions with Karen and his interventions as Mysterian, Kenny works to build her confidence, teach her about navigating dangerous situations, and provide the emotional support necessary for healthy psychological development. His protection operates on multiple timescales, addressing immediate threats while also building foundations for her future resilience and success. Kenny's relationship with Karen serves as a counterbalance to the cosmic horror and supernatural trauma that define other aspects of his existence, providing him with clear evidence that his suffering serves meaningful purposes and that his sacrifices create genuine benefits for someone who deserves protection and care. While his deaths and resurrections might serve the entertainment of cosmic entities or the narrative requirements of his universe, his protection of Karen operates from pure love and creates measurable improvements in the life of someone whose well-being matters more to him than his own comfort or safety. The symbolic significance of Kenny's role as Karen's guardian angel extends beyond individual character development to encompass broader themes about family responsibility, social protection of vulnerable individuals, and the ways that love can triumph over circumstances that seem designed to destroy human connection. Their relationship demonstrates that even in environments characterized by dysfunction and trauma, bonds of genuine care can form and flourish, creating pockets of safety and love that resist the corrosive effects of poverty and neglect. The future implications of Kenny's guardianship of Karen suggest that his protective influence will continue shaping her development long after their childhood circumstances change, providing her with internal resources and psychological foundations that will serve her throughout her life. The confidence she gains from knowing that someone powerful and loving is watching over her, the resilience she develops through experiencing protection during vulnerable moments, and the model of selfless care that Kenny provides will influence her own capacity for relationships and her understanding of how love operates in the world. Kenny's devotion to Karen's well-being reveals the transformative power of having someone to protect and care for, showing how responsibility for another person's welfare can give meaning and purpose to experiences that might otherwise seem random or cruel. Through his relationship with Karen, Kenny discovers that his supernatural abilities and traumatic experiences can serve positive purposes, that his suffering can be transformed into strength that protects innocence and nurtures growth. In the quiet moments when Mysterion sits with Karen during her distress, offering comfort that no one else can provide, we see the purest expression of Kenny's heroic nature and the most profound justification for all the pain he has endured in service of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The creation of Mysterion as Kenny McCormick's superhero identity represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated transformations in the entire South Park universe, as it provides Kenny with the voice, authority, and agency that his civilian existence has consistently denied him, while channeling his supernatural curse into purposeful, heroic action that serves his community's genuine needs. Unlike the fantasy role-playing that characterizes his friends' superhero games or the attention-seeking behavior that motivates characters like Cartman's The Coon persona, Mysterion emerges from Kenny's authentic desire to use his unique abilities and tragic experiences to protect others from harm and provide assistance to those who cannot help themselves. The costume, the name, and the entire conceptual framework of his heroic identity serve not as escapism from his difficult reality, but as a means of transforming that reality into something meaningful and constructive. The visual design of Kenny's Mysterion costume reflects his sophisticated understanding of how symbols communicate meaning and how presentation affects the reception of heroic intervention in real-world situations. The dark color scheme creates an appropriately serious and mysterious atmosphere that commands respect and attention in ways that Kenny's normal appearance cannot achieve. The question mark emblazoned on his chest serves as both symbol and statement, representing not just the mystery of his concealed identity, but the deeper questions that surround his existence, his immortality, and his place in the cosmic order that governs South Park's reality. This symbolic choice demonstrates Kenny's intuitive grasp of how visual communication operates, and his desire to present himself as someone who understands the profound mysteries that others cannot perceive or comprehend. The practical advantages that the Mysterion persona provides to Kenny's heroic activities extend far beyond simple costume aesthetics to encompass fundamental changes in how he can interact with his community and address the problems he encounters during his patrol activities. The mask that conceals his face eliminates the communication barriers created by his orange parka, allowing him to speak clearly and be understood by everyone he encounters, without the muffling effects that normally render his words incomprehensible. This transformation from inaudible victim to articulate protector represents perhaps the most significant psychological shift in Kenny's entire character development, as it enables him to express his intelligence, compassion, and moral vision in ways that his civilian identity has never allowed. The authority that Kenny commands as Mysterion reflects his deep understanding of how respect and credibility operate in social situations, particularly when dealing with individuals who might otherwise dismiss or ignore his attempts at intervention. The superhero persona creates expectations about competence, moral authority, and effectiveness that work in Kenny's favor when he attempts to address criminal behavior or protect vulnerable community members. Adults who would never take seriously the concerns or observations of a 9-year-old boy in an orange parka find themselves listening carefully to Mysterion's warnings, and following his guidance, demonstrating how presentation and context can dramatically alter the reception of identical information or advice. Kenny's development of patrol patterns and investigation techniques as Mysterion reveals his systematic approach to community protection and his growing sophistication in identifying and addressing threats before they can cause significant harm. Unlike reactive heroism that responds to crises after they have already developed, Kenny's work as Mysterion emphasizes prevention and early intervention, using his immortality as a tactical advantage that allows him to take risks and gather intelligence that would be impossible for mortal vigilantes. His willingness to place himself in dangerous situations to document criminal activity or verify threats demonstrates how his supernatural abilities can serve constructive purposes when guided by genuine moral conviction and strategic thinking. The psychological profile of Kenny's heroic identity reveals complex motivations that combine altruistic concern for others with personal needs for agency, recognition, and meaningful action that his civilian existence cannot satisfy. As Mysterion, Kenny experiences validation and effectiveness that his normal life consistently denies him, creating powerful psychological rewards that reinforce his commitment to heroic service, while potentially creating dependency on his alternate identity for emotional fulfillment and self-worth. This dynamic reflects broader themes about how individuals with extraordinary abilities or traumatic backgrounds might use heroic personas to meet psychological needs that conventional social roles cannot address. The relationship between Kenny's immortality and his effectiveness as Mysterion creates unique advantages that enable forms of heroic service that would be impossible for normal vigilantes or law enforcement personnel. His ability to survive lethal encounters means that he can gather evidence in extremely dangerous situations, confront heavily armed criminals without backup, and pursue investigations that would be suicidal for mortal individuals. This tactical advantage allows Kenny to operate with a level of boldness and risk acceptance that makes him extraordinarily effective at disrupting criminal activities and protecting potential victims, though it also creates ethical questions about whether his immortality obligates him to accept greater risks than normal heroes could reasonably be expected to face. The community response to Mysterion's activities reflects South Park's complex relationship with authority figures and its residents' simultaneous desire for protection and suspicion of individuals who claim moral authority over others. Kenny's careful management of his public image as Mysterion demonstrates his understanding that effective heroism requires community acceptance and cooperation rather than simply individual acts of courage or intervention. His success in building trust and credibility within South Park reveals sophisticated social intelligence and emotional maturity that his apparent passivity and communication difficulties normally prevent others from recognizing or appreciating. The investigation into his own origins that Kenny undertakes during the Cthulhu trilogy represents perhaps his most ambitious and dangerous use of his Mysterion identity, as he employs his heroic persona to seek answers about the supernatural forces that govern his existence, while working to protect his community from cosmic threats that operate beyond normal human comprehension. This storyline demonstrates how Kenny's heroic identity serves multiple functions simultaneously, providing him with the tools and authority necessary to confront mysteries that affect not just his individual fate but the safety and well-being of everyone around him. The psychological burden of maintaining dual identities creates ongoing challenges for Kenny as he attempts to balance his responsibilities as Mysterion with his obligations as Kenny McCormick, son, brother, and friend. The secrecy required to protect his heroic identity prevents him from receiving recognition or emotional support for his most meaningful and difficult work, creating additional layers of isolation and stress that compound the existing challenges of his supernatural existence and dysfunctional family life. This isolation reflects broader themes about the costs of heroic service and the loneliness that often accompanies great responsibility. Kenny's relationship with other costumed heroes during the superhero episodes reveals his mature understanding of heroism compared to his friends' more superficial engagement with superhero fantasies. While characters like Cartman use their heroic personas primarily for personal aggrandizement and social manipulation, Kenny approaches superhero work with genuine seriousness and commitment to serving others. His frustration with his friends' focus on personal glory rather than actual heroic service demonstrates his sophisticated understanding of what authentic heroism requires, and his disappointment with their failure to share his commitment to meaningful action. The evolution of Kenny's Mysterian persona throughout the series shows his growing confidence and competence as both investigator and protector, as he develops more sophisticated techniques for gathering information, more effective methods for intervention, and deeper understanding of how to work within South Park's social and institutional frameworks to achieve positive results. This character development reflects not just accumulated experience, but genuine psychological growth, as Kenny learns to channel his traumatic experiences and supernatural abilities into increasingly effective forms of heroic service. The technological and logistical aspects of Kenny's work as Mysterian reveal his resourcefulness and creativity in overcoming the economic limitations that constrain his civilian identity. His ability to create effective costume and equipment from limited resources, to develop investigation techniques that work despite his lack of formal training, and to coordinate complex operations without access to advanced technology or institutional support, demonstrates remarkable innovation and determination. These practical skills reflect broader themes about how genuine heroism often emerges from ordinary individuals who find extraordinary ways to serve others despite significant constraints and challenges. The moral philosophy that guides Kenny's work as Mysterian reflects sophisticated ethical thinking about the proper use of power, the responsibilities that come with extraordinary abilities, and the relationship between personal suffering and obligation to help others. His consistent choice to use his immortality in service of protection rather than personal gain demonstrates moral maturity that transcends his apparent age and circumstances, suggesting that his traumatic experiences have created wisdom and compassion rather than cynicism or self-interest. This ethical framework provides foundation for understanding why Kenny's heroism feels authentic and meaningful rather than performative or self-serving. The impact of Kenny's work as Mysterian extends beyond the immediate benefits of his specific interventions to encompass broader effects on South Park's social fabric and moral atmosphere. His presence as a protector and investigator creates deterrent effects that prevent some criminal activities from occurring, while his interventions in crisis situations inspire other community members to take greater responsibility for each other's welfare and safety. These ripple effects demonstrate how individual heroism can influence community culture and create positive changes that extend far beyond the hero's direct actions. The relationship between Kenny's work as Mysterian and his civilian relationships creates ongoing tensions and complications that reflect the challenges faced by anyone who maintains significant secrets from those closest to them. His inability to share his heroic experiences with his friends and family prevents him from receiving emotional support for his most meaningful work, while creating barriers to intimacy and authentic connection in his personal relationships. These dynamics reveal the personal costs of heroic service and the sacrifices that dedicated heroes must make to protect both their effectiveness and the safety of those they love. The symbolic significance of Mysterian as Kenny's heroic identity extends beyond individual character development to encompass broader themes about transformation, redemption, and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose within even the most difficult circumstances. Through his superhero persona, Kenny demonstrates that trauma and suffering need not define or limit an individual's potential for positive action, that extraordinary circumstances can create opportunities for extraordinary service, and that genuine heroism emerges not from perfection or privilege, but from the decision to use whatever abilities one possesses in service of others' welfare and protection. In the quiet moments between crises, when Mysterion patrols the streets of South Park, watching for threats and ready to intervene when needed, we see the purest expression of Kenny's character and the most profound transformation of his supernatural curse into meaningful purpose. The question mark on his chest reminds us that mystery and uncertainty need not prevent action, that we can choose to protect and serve others even when we do not fully understand our own nature or destiny, and that sometimes the most important heroism happens in darkness and silence, known only to those who benefit from protection they may never recognize or acknowledge. In the complex emotional landscape of Kenny McCormick's development, perhaps no aspect reveals more about his fundamental humanity and desperate need for authentic connection than his approach to romantic relationships, which represents both his greatest vulnerability and his most hopeful reach toward normalcy in a life otherwise defined by supernatural trauma and social isolation. Kenny's romantic pursuits operate as psychological lifelines that connect him to experiences of joy, validation, and emotional intimacy that his family dysfunction and supernatural curse have largely denied him, creating moments of genuine happiness that stand in stark contrast to the endless cycle of death and resurrection that characterizes his supernatural existence. Through his relationships with girls, Kenny discovers aspects of himself that remain hidden behind his muffled voice and tragic circumstances, revealing depths of charm, sensitivity, and emotional intelligence that surprise both himself and those fortunate enough to see past his economic limitations and communication barriers. The relationship that develops between Kenny and Kelly during the rainforest expedition represents his first genuine experience with mutual romantic attraction and emotional intimacy, providing a template for understanding what Kenny seeks in romantic connections, and how his unique circumstances both enable and complicate his ability to form meaningful relationships with others. Kelly's initial dismissal of the environmental choir as potentially boring or preachy mirrors Kenny's own skepticism about adult organized activities and institutional approaches to solving complex problems, creating common ground that enables them to connect despite their different backgrounds and circumstances. Her willingness to see past his muffled speech and economic limitations, to recognize his intelligence, humor, and genuine caring nature provides Kenny with validation that his own friends and family have consistently failed to offer. The significance of Kelly being able to understand Kenny's muffled speech cannot be overstated in terms of its impact on his psychological development and self-perception, as it represents the first time someone has invested genuine effort in comprehending his thoughts and responding to his actual words, rather than dismissing him as incomprehensible or irrelevant. This breakthrough in communication creates possibilities for authentic connection that Kenny has never experienced before, allowing him to express his personality, share his thoughts, and participate in conversations as an equal rather than as a source of comic relief or pity. The psychological relief of being truly heard and understood transforms Kenny's entire approach to social interaction, giving him confidence to be more expressive and emotionally open than his usual circumstances allow. Kenny's willingness to jump in front of gunfire to protect Kelly during their rainforest adventure demonstrates how his immortality enables acts of heroic devotion that would be impossible for normal individuals, while also revealing his instinctive understanding that true love requires willingness to sacrifice for another person's welfare and safety. This moment of protection operates on multiple levels simultaneously, serving as both romantic gesture and heroic action while establishing patterns of behavior that will characterize Kenny's approach to all his most meaningful relationships. His decision to risk his life for Kelly's safety reflects not reckless disregard for his own welfare, but rather sophisticated calculation about how his supernatural abilities can serve purposes beyond mere survival or entertainment. The long-distance relationship that Kenny and Kelly attempt to maintain after the choir's departure from South Park reveals both his capacity for sustained emotional commitment and the practical challenges that his economic circumstances create for maintaining connections with people from different social backgrounds. The promise to call each other every other day represents Kenny's first attempt at adult-style relationship maintenance, requiring him to navigate scheduling challenges, family dysfunction, and economic limitations that make even basic communication difficult to sustain. This relationship teaches Kenny important lessons about the work required to maintain emotional connections across distance and circumstance, preparing him for future romantic challenges, while demonstrating his willingness to invest effort in relationships that matter to him. The tragic timing of Kenny's death, just as he and Kelly are making plans for their future together, creates one of the series' most poignant examples of how his supernatural curse interferes with his attempts to build normal human relationships and achieve the kind of happiness that other children take for granted. Kelly's decision to attempt CPR, rather than simply accepting his death as inevitable, represents the first time someone has treated Kenny's mortality as a genuine crisis, requiring immediate action rather than a source of entertainment or casual conversation. Her success in reviving him suggests that love and genuine care might have power to overcome even supernatural constraints, offering hope that Kenny's curse might be breakable through sufficient human connection and emotional investment. The relationship between Kenny and Tammy Warner during the Purity Ring episode reveals different aspects of his romantic nature and his approach to sexuality, as he navigates the complex terrain of adolescent sexual awakening while dealing with external pressures and moral frameworks that attempt to control and regulate intimate relationships. Kenny's initial excitement about Tammy's reputation reflects normal adolescent curiosity about sexuality, combined with his characteristic willingness to pursue experiences that other children might find intimidating or overwhelming. His approach to sexual relationships demonstrates the same courage and openness that characterizes his heroic activities, showing willingness to explore new experiences and emotional territories despite potential risks or complications. The psychological impact of the Purity Ring on Kenny and Tammy's relationship creates a fascinating study in how external moral frameworks can interfere with natural, emotional, and physical development, transforming a potentially healthy exploration of adolescent sexuality into a source of guilt, frustration, and artificial constraint. Kenny's response to these imposed limitations reveals his mature understanding that authentic relationships require freedom and mutual choice, rather than external regulation or moral policing. His ability to maintain genuine affection for Tammy, despite these complications, demonstrates emotional sophistication that transcends typical adolescent relationship dynamics. Kenny's pattern of attraction to older or more mature partners reflects his accelerated psychological development and his need for relationships that can match his emotional depth and life experience. Even though his apparent age and economic circumstances often prevent others from recognizing his maturity and wisdom, the trauma and responsibility that have shaped his character creates psychological needs that require partners capable of understanding complexity and depth rather than simple childhood companionship or superficial attraction. This pattern also reflects his desire to escape the limitations of his peer group and family environment by connecting with individuals who represent different possibilities for emotional growth and authentic connection. The economic dimensions of Kenny's romantic relationships create ongoing challenges as he attempts to participate in dating activities and relationship rituals that require financial resources his family cannot provide, forcing him to develop creative approaches to romance that emphasize emotional connection and personal attention rather than material gestures or expensive activities. His ability to create meaningful romantic experiences despite economic limitations demonstrates resourcefulness and emotional intelligence that compensate for his material disadvantages, while revealing the authentic caring that motivates his romantic pursuits. These experiences teach him that genuine love transcends economic circumstances, though they also create ongoing stress about his ability to provide for partners in ways that society typically expects from romantic relationships. The communication breakthroughs that Kenny experiences in romantic contexts reveal how emotional intimacy can overcome even significant barriers to understanding and connection, as partners who care deeply about him invest extra effort in comprehending his muffled speech and responding to his actual thoughts, rather than dismissing him as incomprehensible. These moments of clear communication create possibilities for authentic self-expression that transform Kenny's entire approach to relationships, giving him confidence to share his thoughts, feelings, and experiences in ways that his normal social interactions rarely allow. The psychological relief of being truly understood creates powerful emotional bonds that make these romantic connections especially meaningful and important to his overall well-being. Kenny's approach to romantic conflict and relationship challenges demonstrates emotional maturity that exceeds his apparent age and reflects the wisdom gained through his traumatic experiences and ongoing exposure to adult dysfunction and complexity. Rather than responding to relationship problems with childish tantrums or manipulative behavior, Kenny typically approaches romantic difficulties with patience, understanding, and willingness to work through problems constructively. This mature approach to relationship maintenance reflects his deep appreciation for authentic human connection and his understanding that meaningful relationships require ongoing effort and emotional investment from both partners. The impact of Kenny's immortality on his romantic relationships creates unique psychological dynamics, as he must navigate the knowledge that any partner he forms deep connections with will eventually forget his deaths and resurrections, creating barriers to complete intimacy and authentic sharing of his most significant life experiences. This supernatural obstacle to relationship depth creates ongoing tension between his desire for complete honesty with romantic partners and his understanding that sharing too much about his supernatural circumstances might damage or destroy the connections he values most highly. The isolation created by this secret knowledge adds layers of complexity to all his romantic pursuits, while highlighting the courage required to continue seeking love despite such significant barriers. The protective instincts that Kenny develops toward his romantic partners mirror the heroic behavior he demonstrates in other contexts, as he uses his supernatural abilities and accumulated wisdom to shield those he loves from dangers they might not recognize or understand. His willingness to place himself at risk to protect romantic partners reflects the same moral courage that characterizes his superhero activities, while also demonstrating how love transforms his relationship with his own mortality and supernatural curse. These protective behaviors reveal Kenny's understanding that love creates responsibilities and obligations that transcend self-interest or personal safety. The seasonal and episodic nature of Kenny's romantic relationships within the show's structure creates patterns of connection and loss that mirror the broader themes of his character development. as he repeatedly experiences the joy of finding authentic connection, followed by the pain of inevitable separation or tragedy. These cycles of romantic hope and disappointment reflect broader patterns in Kenny's life, while demonstrating his remarkable resilience and continued willingness to remain emotionally open despite repeated heartbreak and loss. His ability to continue pursuing romantic connections despite these patterns of disappointment reveals emotional courage that complements his physical heroism. The contrast between Kenny's romantic relationships and the dysfunctional family dynamics that characterize his home environment highlights how love and authentic connection can provide alternative models for human relationships that transcend the limitations of his immediate circumstances. Through his romantic pursuits, Kenny discovers possibilities for emotional intimacy, mutual respect, and genuine caring that stand in stark contrast to the addiction, violence, and neglect that define his family relationships. These experiences provide him with hope and motivation to continue developing his capacity for love and connection despite the ongoing challenges created by his supernatural curse and economic circumstances. The therapeutic aspects of Kenny's romantic relationships reveal how love and emotional intimacy can provide healing and validation that address some of the psychological damage created by his traumatic experiences and social isolation. Partners who see past his economic limitations and communication barriers to recognize his intelligence, sensitivity, and genuine caring nature provide Kenny with experiences of being valued and appreciated that his family and peer relationships have largely failed to offer. These validating experiences create psychological resources that strengthen his overall resilience and emotional stability. Kenny's romantic relationships serve as windows into aspects of his personality and emotional capacity that remain hidden in other contexts, revealing depths of charm, humor, and emotional intelligence that his muffled speech and tragic circumstances typically prevent others from recognizing or appreciating. In romantic contexts, Kenny's true self emerges more fully as partners invest the effort necessary to understand his communication and respond to his authentic thoughts and feelings, rather than to surface impressions or social assumptions. These glimpses of Kenny's complete personality demonstrate the fullness of what his community loses by failing to see past his apparent limitations. The hope that romantic relationships represent in Kenny's life extends beyond immediate pleasure or companionship to encompass broader possibilities for escape from the cycles of trauma and isolation that otherwise define his finite existence, offering pathways toward emotional healing, authentic connection, and meaningful partnership that could provide foundation for different kinds of life experiences. Through his romantic pursuits, Kenny demonstrates that love represents not just personal fulfillment, but also potential transformation, creating possibilities for breaking free from the supernatural and social constraints that otherwise seem to trap him in endless repetition of suffering and loss. In the quiet moments of romantic connection, when Kenny experiences the simple joy of being understood and valued by someone who sees past his limitations to recognize his authentic worth, we glimpse the person he might have become under different circumstances, and the healing power of love to transform even the most damaged and isolated individuals into sources of warmth and connection for others. In the intricate social ecosystem of South Park Elementary, no relationship reveals more about the cruel dynamics of childhood friendship than the treatment Kenny McCormick receives from his supposed best friends Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, and Eric Cartman, a trio whose casual dismissal of his worth and systematic failure to recognize his contributions creates one of fiction's most devastating portraits of how good people can become complicit in the marginalization of those they claim to care about. The tragedy of Kenny's position within this friend group lies not in overt hostility or intentional cruelty, but in the subtle and persistent ways that his friends reduce him to a source of entertainment, a convenient fourth member when needed, and ultimately, a disposable presence whose absence would be regrettable, but not truly devastating to their social dynamics. This pattern of benign neglect and unconscious devaluation creates psychological wounds that cut deeper than outright rejection, as Kenny must navigate the complex emotional terrain of loving people who consistently demonstrate that they do not fully see or value him as an individual deserving of respect and consideration. The iconic catchphrase that follows Kenny's deaths represents perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of how his friends transform his genuine suffering into entertainment value, treating his traumatic experiences as punchlines rather than tragedies that should evoke compassion and concern. When Stan and Kyle respond to Kenny's deaths with their ritualistic, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny, you bastards," they create a framework that positions Kenny's suffering as spectacle rather than genuine loss, establishing emotional distance that protects them from having to process the horror of repeatedly watching their friend die in violent and painful ways. This catchphrase becomes a psychological defense mechanism that allows Stan and Kyle to maintain their friendship with Kenny while avoiding the emotional complexity of truly confronting what his immortality means and what his repeated deaths cost him psychologically. The mathematical precision with which Kenny's friends forget his deaths reveals the supernatural elements of his curse, while highlighting their unconscious willingness to accept convenient amnesia rather than wrestling with uncomfortable truths about mortality, suffering, and their own failure to protect someone they supposedly care about. Each morning when Kenny returns to school after a violent death, his friends greet him as if nothing has happened, their memories apparently wiped clean of the traumatic events they witnessed the previous day. This supernatural forgetting serves the cosmic forces that govern Kenny's existence, but it also reflects deeper psychological truths about how people often choose to forget uncomfortable realities, rather than confronting their own complicity in systems that cause harm to others. Stan's particularly cruel comment during the Jeffersons episode, when he dismisses Kenny's heroic actions with "whatever, at least you finally get to do something," reveals the depth of his unconscious contempt for Kenny's perceived passivity and his complete failure to recognize the countless times Kenny has sacrificed himself for their benefit. This moment of casual cruelty demonstrates how even well-intentioned friends can internalize social hierarchies that position certain individuals as less valuable or interesting than others, creating patterns of dismissal and devaluation that become so automatic they operate below the level of conscious awareness. Stan's comment reflects years of accumulated assumptions about Kenny's worth and capabilities. Assumptions that blind him to evidence of Kenny's intelligence, courage, and moral character that contradicts his prejudices. The economic dimensions of Kenny's marginalization within the friend group create additional layers of exclusion as his friends consistently plan activities, make purchases, and discuss experiences that remain beyond his financial reach, while showing little awareness of how their casual references to material abundance highlight his poverty and exclusion. When Cartman suggests that Kenny's mother might put a toy on layaway, the comment reveals not just economic ignorance, but fundamental failure to understand how $8.95 represents a significant expense for a family struggling to meet basic survival needs. These moments of economic insensitivity accumulate over time to create patterns of exclusion that reinforce Kenny's sense that he exists on the margins of his friends' lives, rather than as a full participant in their shared experiences. The gaming system disparity that leaves Kenny playing alone with his outdated ColecoVision, while his friends enjoy shared experiences on their modern Nintendo systems, creates forms of cultural exclusion that extend beyond simple material deprivation to encompass access to the shared, references, inside jokes, and common experiences that bind friend groups together. Kenny's exclusion from these gaming experiences creates gaps in his cultural knowledge and social connection that compound over time, leaving him increasingly unable to participate in conversations and activities that define his peer group's social bonds. His friends' failure to recognize or address these exclusionary dynamics demonstrates their unconscious acceptance of economic inequality as natural and acceptable, rather than as a barrier to genuine friendship that should be actively addressed. Kyle's relationship with Kenny reveals particularly complex dynamics as his strong moral convictions and commitment to justice create expectations that he should be more aware of Kenny's marginalization and more willing to advocate for his inclusion and recognition. Yet Kyle often demonstrates the same blind spots and casual dismissal that characterize Stan's treatment of Kenny, suggesting that even individuals with highly developed moral sensibilities can fail to recognize injustice when it operates through subtle social dynamics rather than obvious discrimination or violence. Kyle's failure to consistently defend Kenny from Cartman's abuse, or to challenge the group's patterns of exclusion, reveals how moral conviction can coexist with unconscious participation in systems of marginalization. The Vacation Special's treatment of Kenny as shared custody represents perhaps the most explicit example of how his friends view him as an obligation to be managed, rather than a person whose feelings and preferences deserve consideration and respect. When Stan, Kyle, and Cartman decide to end their friendship, they discuss Kenny's fate in terms that explicitly compare him to a child whose custody must be arranged between divorcing parents, reducing him to a burden that must be allocated fairly, rather than recognizing him as an autonomous individual whose own wishes about the situation might be relevant. This dehumanizing language reveals how completely his friends have internalized their own superiority over Kenny and their assumption that his role in their lives is to accommodate their decisions rather than participate as an equal in making choices about their shared relationships. The patronizing tone that his friends adopt when addressing Kenny during the custody discussion demonstrates their unconscious assumption that he lacks the intellectual capacity to understand complex social situations or contribute meaningful input to decisions that affect his own well-being. Their suggestion that he go get on your iPad for a minute while they discuss his future treats him like a child who must be distracted while adults make important decisions, completely ignoring his emotional investment in their friendship and his right to participate in conversations about relationships that matter deeply to him. This pattern of exclusion from decision-making processes reflects broader assumptions about Kenny's value and capabilities that his friends have never questioned or examined. Kenny's consistent loyalty to friends who treat him as disposable creates one of the most heartbreaking aspects of his character development as he continues investing emotional energy and genuine care in relationships that provide him with minimal reciprocal support or recognition. His willingness to participate in their schemes, support their causes, and maintain their friendships, despite repeated evidence of their indifference to his well-being, demonstrates remarkable emotional generosity and perhaps pathological attachment to relationships that consistently undervalue his contributions. This loyalty reflects both his desperate need for human connection and his internalized acceptance of his own marginalization as natural and deserved. The academic and intellectual dismissal that Kenny experiences from his friends reflects their failure to recognize his intelligence and insight, despite numerous demonstrations of his analytical capabilities and emotional wisdom. His muffled speech creates barriers to showcasing his intellectual gifts, but his friends have never made genuine efforts to understand his communications or recognize the sophistication of his thinking when it becomes clear through his actions rather than his words. Their assumption that communication difficulties indicate intellectual limitations reveals prejudices about disability and difference that prevent them from recognizing Kenny's actual capabilities and contributions to their group dynamic. The heroic actions that Kenny repeatedly performs for his friends' benefit go largely unrecognized and unappreciated because his friends have developed psychological frameworks that position him as passive recipient of their charity, rather than active agent capable of meaningful action and sacrifice. His willingness to die for their safety, his interventions in crises that threaten their well-being, and his consistent prioritization of their needs over his own comfort create patterns of self-sacrifice that his friends take for granted, rather than recognizing as evidence of extraordinary loyalty and moral character. Their failure to acknowledge these sacrifices reflects deeper assumptions about Kenny's role in their lives as someone who exists to serve their needs, rather than as an individual deserving of gratitude and recognition. The social events and activities that Kenny's friends plan without considering his ability to participate create ongoing patterns of exclusion that reinforce his marginalization, while demonstrating their unconscious assumption that his presence is optional rather than essential to their group dynamics. Birthday parties at expensive venues, trips to locations requiring transportation costs, and activities requiring equipment or fees that Kenny cannot afford, all serve to exclude him from shared experiences that define friendship, while his friends remain oblivious to the barriers they have created. Their failure to adapt their social planning to ensure Kenny's inclusion reveals how little consideration they give to his perspective and circumstances. The emotional labor that Kenny consistently provides to his friends receives no recognition or reciprocal support, as they treat his empathy and emotional availability as natural resources to be consumed rather than gifts that deserve appreciation and reciprocation. His willingness to listen to their problems, support them through crises, and provide comfort during difficult times creates patterns of one-sided emotional exchange, where Kenny gives consistently while receiving minimal emotional support in return. Their failure to recognize or reciprocate this emotional generosity reflects broader patterns of taking Kenny for granted, while assuming that his needs and feelings are less important than their own. The leadership dynamics within the friend group consistently position Kenny as follower rather than contributor, despite his demonstrated wisdom and moral clarity in complex situations where his friend's judgment becomes clouded by self-interest or emotional reactivity. His insights and suggestions are dismissed or ignored, even when subsequent events prove their validity, creating patterns where Kenny's intellectual contributions are systematically undervalued, regardless of their quality or relevance. This exclusion from group decision-making reflects assumptions about his capabilities and worth that his friends have never bothered to question or examine through direct engagement with his actual thoughts and perspectives. The crisis situations that reveal Kenny's true character and capabilities often occur when his friends are too distracted or self-absorbed to notice his heroic actions, creating tragic ironies where his most impressive and morally significant behaviors go unwitnessed and unappreciated by the people whose opinions matter most to him. His sacrificial actions during emergencies, his protection of vulnerable community members, and his willingness to risk his safety for others' benefit typically occur outside the awareness of Stan, Kyle, and Cartman, preventing them from developing more accurate understanding of his character and capabilities. The cultural and social capital that Kenny lacks, due to his economic circumstances, creates additional barriers to equal participation in friendship activities, while his friends remain largely unaware of how their casual references to experiences and possessions highlight his exclusion from middle-class childhood culture. Their discussions of movies, restaurants, vacation destinations, and consumer goods create conversational territories where Kenny cannot participate as an equal, reinforcing his sense of marginalization, while demonstrating his friends' unconscious assumption that their experiences represent universal rather than privileged perspectives. The long-term psychological impact of being consistently undervalued by his closest friends creates internal conflicts for Kenny as he struggles between his genuine affection for Stan, Kyle, and Cartman and his growing awareness of their failure to recognize his worth or treat him with appropriate respect and consideration. This tension between love and disappointment reflects broader themes about how individuals respond to relationships that provide some benefits while consistently failing to meet deeper needs for recognition, appreciation, and genuine emotional reciprocity. The ultimate tragedy of Kenny's treatment by his friends lies not in any single act of cruelty or neglect, but in the accumulated weight of countless small dismissals, casual exclusions, and unconscious devaluations that combine to create a friendship dynamic where Kenny's humanity becomes secondary to his utility, where his suffering becomes entertainment, and where his loyalty becomes an assumption rather than a gift that deserves recognition and reciprocation. In the quiet moments when Kenny walks alone after another day of being overlooked by those he loves most, we see the profound cost of friendships that take more than they give, and the remarkable resilience required to continue caring for people who consistently demonstrate their inability to care equally in return. The psychological landscape of Kenny McCormick's existence presents one of fiction's most harrowing examinations of trauma's cumulative effects, as his repeated experiences with violent death create layers of psychological damage that would overwhelm any normal individual, while demonstrating the remarkable resilience of the human spirit under even the most impossible circumstances. Unlike fictional characters who die once and return changed, or those who face death as a single climactic challenge, Kenny endures an endless cycle of traumatic termination that forces him to confront mortality, not as an abstract concept or future possibility, but as a recurring reality that intrudes into his daily experience with brutal regularity and unpredictable timing. Each death brings not just physical pain and terror, but the psychological burden of knowing that this experience will repeat indefinitely, that no amount of caution or wisdom can permanently protect him from the cosmic forces that orchestrate his destruction for purposes he cannot comprehend or influence. The neurological impact of experiencing violent death repeatedly while retaining conscious memory of each incident creates psychological conditions that exist beyond the normal spectrum of human trauma response, as Kenny's brain must process and integrate experiences that violate fundamental assumptions about reality, safety, and the basic continuity of existence. Traditional trauma psychology assumes that individuals experience overwhelming events as isolated incidents that can be processed and integrated into coherent life narratives through appropriate therapeutic intervention and time. Kenny's situation inverts these assumptions completely, creating ongoing exposure to the most extreme trauma possible, while denying him access to the social support systems and memory processing mechanisms that normally help individuals recover from overwhelming experiences. The memory retention that characterizes Kenny's supernatural curse ensures that each death becomes part of an accumulating psychological burden rather than a discrete event that can be forgotten or compartmentalized through normal mental defense mechanisms. while his friends and family benefit from supernatural amnesia that protects them from having to process the horror of witnessing his repeated deaths. Kenny alone carries the complete record of his traumatic experiences, remembering not just the physical sensations of dying, but the emotional context surrounding each death, the reactions of witnesses, and the terrible knowledge that these patterns will continue indefinitely regardless of his preferences or behavior. The variety of deaths that Kenny experiences creates a comprehensive catalogue of human mortality that exposes him to every conceivable form of physical destruction, while preventing him from developing adaptive strategies or psychological defenses that might mitigate the trauma of specific types of death. Unlike individuals who might fear particular forms of mortality based on limited exposure or imagination, Kenny possesses direct, experiential knowledge of being crushed, burned, shot, dismembered, poisoned, and destroyed in countless other ways, creating a psychological database of suffering that would be impossible to accumulate through any other means and unbearable for any normal consciousness to contain. The existential crisis that emerges from Kenny's unique relationship with mortality extends beyond simple fear of death to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and personal continuity that most individuals never need to confront directly. Each time Kenny dies and returns, he must grapple with questions about whether he is the same person who died, or a new individual with implanted memories, whether his consciousness truly survives the transition, or whether each Kenny represents a separate being who believes himself to be continuous with his predecessor. These philosophical questions become practical, psychological challenges that affect his sense of self and his understanding of his own agency and significance. The social isolation created by Kenny's unique experiences with death compounds his trauma by denying him access to the validation and support that normally help individuals process overwhelming experiences and maintain psychological stability. Because no one else remembers his deaths or understands the scope of his suffering, Kenny cannot seek comfort, advice, or simple acknowledgement from the people closest to him, forcing him to bear his psychological burden alone, while maintaining normal social relationships with individuals who remain oblivious to his most significant life experiences. This enforced secrecy creates additional stress, as Kenny must constantly monitor his behavior and conversations to avoid revealing his supernatural circumstances, while managing the emotional aftermath of repeated trauma. The hypervigilance that develops from Kenny's awareness that death can strike at any moment without warning creates chronic psychological tension that affects every aspect of his daily experience. As he learns to scan his environment constantly for potential threats, while understanding that his supernatural curse makes such precautions ultimately futile. This state of constant alertness to danger creates exhausting mental strain that normal children never experience, forcing Kenny to navigate childhood activities and social relationships while carrying adult-level awareness of mortality and vulnerability. The psychological energy required to maintain this vigilance while participating in normal childhood activities creates internal conflicts between his desire for normalcy and his traumatic knowledge of reality's instability. The dissociative responses that Kenny develops as psychological protection from overwhelming trauma create complex internal dynamics where he learns to separate his consciousness from his physical experiences during moments of extreme pain or terror. These dissociative skills, while adaptive in the context of his supernatural circumstances, create barriers to normal emotional processing and integration that may interfere with his ability to form authentic connections with others or access his own emotional responses during non-traumatic situations. The psychological mechanisms that protect him from experiencing the full horror of his deaths also create distance from positive experiences and emotional intimacy. The post-traumatic stress manifestations in Kenny's behavior include hyper-arousal symptoms, intrusive memories, and avoidance behaviors that reflect normal psychological responses to abnormal circumstances, though his symptoms operate within the context of ongoing rather than past trauma. His difficulty concentrating at school, his heightened startle responses, his tendency to engage in high-risk behaviors, and his periodic emotional numbness all represent appropriate psychological adaptations to his impossible circumstances, while creating additional barriers to normal social and academic functioning that compound his existing challenges with poverty and family dysfunction. The survivor guilt that Kenny experiences takes on unique dimensions as he struggles with the knowledge that his friends and family remain vulnerable to permanent death, while he alone possesses the cosmic protection that makes his mortality ultimately reversible. This creates complex emotions about his own suffering, as he recognizes that his trauma, while severe, occurs within the context of guaranteed resurrection, while others face genuine permanent loss when they encounter similar dangers. The guilt associated with his supernatural advantages combines with resentment about his forced participation in cosmic entertainment to create internal conflicts that normal trauma survivors never face. The meaning-making challenges that emerge from Kenny's experiences with meaningless death create existential struggles as he attempts to understand his place in a universe where his suffering serves no apparent purpose beyond entertainment for cosmic entities whose motivations remain incomprehensible to human consciousness. Traditional frameworks for understanding suffering, whether religious, philosophical, or psychological, provide little comfort for someone whose pain serves no redemptive purpose and contributes to no greater good beyond feeding the appetites of beings whose existence transcends human moral categories. This absence of meaning creates spiritual crisis that compounds his psychological trauma. The coping mechanisms that Kenny develops to manage his impossible circumstances reveal remarkable creativity and resilience as he learns to find purpose and satisfaction within the constraints of his supernatural prison. His turn toward heroism represents one adaptive strategy, transforming his immortality from pure curse into tool for protecting others who cannot protect themselves. His development of romantic relationships provides another coping mechanism, creating connections and experiences that offer temporary refuge from his traumatic reality, while providing motivation to continue enduring his circumstances. The substance abuse that Kenny engages in through his cheesing episodes represents a more problematic but understandable response to trauma, as he seeks chemical escape from psychological pain that no conventional therapy or support system could adequately address. The hallucinogenic effects of cat urine provide temporary relief from his traumatic reality while creating artificial experiences of beauty and connection that his normal life cannot provide. While this behavior creates additional risks and complications, it reflects normal human responses to overwhelming psychological pressure and the universal desire to escape unbearable circumstances through altered consciousness. The emotional numbing that occasionally characterizes Kenny's responses to his own deaths represents another psychological adaptation that protects him from experiencing the full emotional impact of repeated trauma while creating barriers to authentic feeling and connection that may interfere with his relationships and personal growth. This numbing serves important protective functions by preventing psychological collapse under impossible circumstances, but it also creates distance from positive emotions and experiences that might provide healing and meaning within his difficult existence. The attachment disorder symptoms that emerge from Kenny's traumatic experiences include difficulties forming secure relationships, due to his understanding that connections with others will be repeatedly disrupted by his deaths, and the taste supernatural amnesia that affects everyone around him. His knowledge that emotional bonds will be forgotten by others, even when they remain meaningful to him, creates approach avoidance conflicts in relationships where he simultaneously craves connection and fears the inevitable loss and disappointment that his circumstances guarantee. The identity fragmentation that results from Kenny's repeated deaths and resurrections creates complex questions about personal continuity and selfhood that affect his psychological development and sense of agency. Each resurrection requires him to reintegrate his sense of self while processing the trauma of his previous death and adjusting to potential changes in his circumstances or relationships that occurred during his absence. This ongoing challenge to identity coherence creates psychological instability that compounds other trauma symptoms, while forcing Kenny to develop unusual flexibility and resilience in maintaining his sense of personal continuity. The cognitive distortions that develop from Kenny's traumatic experiences include altered risk assessment capabilities, where he simultaneously understands dangers more clearly than other children, while also developing inappropriate tolerance for risk due to his knowledge of his own immortality. These distorted thought patterns create decision-making challenges, where Kenny's responses to danger may seem either excessively cautious or recklessly indifferent, depending on circumstances and his current psychological state. The sleep disturbances that likely affect Kenny as a result of his traumatic experiences would create additional challenges for his psychological recovery and daily functioning, as recurring nightmares about his deaths interfere with restorative sleep, while intrusive memories during waking hours create ongoing psychological distress. The combination of trauma-related sleep disruption with the stress of poverty and family dysfunction creates cumulative effects on his mental health and cognitive functioning that compound his existing challenges. The developmental impacts of Kenny's trauma extend beyond immediate psychological symptoms to affect his overall maturation and growth, as he must navigate normal childhood developmental tasks while processing adult-level existential challenges and traumatic experiences. This creates accelerated development in some areas, such as his sophisticated understanding of mortality and suffering, while potentially stunting growth in others, such as his ability to experience appropriate childhood innocence and carefree play. The therapeutic challenges that Kenny's situation would present to any mental health professional attempting to address his trauma include the impossibility of using conventional treatment approaches designed for discrete traumatic events when dealing with ongoing supernatural circumstances that cannot be changed or controlled. Traditional trauma therapy assumes that patients can develop safety and stability in their current circumstances, assumptions that Kenny's supernatural curse makes impossible to fulfill. The resilience factors that enable Kenny to continue functioning despite his impossible circumstances include his natural intelligence, his capacity for finding meaning through helping others, his ability to form meaningful relationships despite significant barriers, and his fundamental optimism about human nature that persists despite his traumatic experiences. These strengths represent remarkable psychological resources that enable him to transform his suffering into wisdom and compassion, rather than cynicism and despair. In the darkest moments of contemplation about Kenny's psychological burden, we encounter profound questions about the limits of human endurance and the mysterious sources of strength that enable some individuals to maintain their humanity and compassion, even under circumstances that should destroy hope and love. His survival represents not just supernatural intervention but triumph of spirit over circumstances, demonstrating that trauma need not define or limit an individual's capacity for growth, connection, and service to others. The culmination of Kenny McCormick's extraordinary journey reaches its most profound expression in the post-COVID specials, where the 40-year passage of time reveals the ultimate trajectory of his character development and the cosmic significance of his lifetime spent in service to others, even when that service went unrecognized and unappreciated by those who benefited most from his sacrifices. Adult Kenny emerges as Dr. Kenneth McCormick, a brilliant scientist and humanitarian whose research into temporal mechanics and quantum physics represents the natural evolution of someone who has spent his entire existence navigating the boundaries between life and death, reality and possibility, individual suffering and collective welfare. His transformation from the muffled-voiced boy in an orange parka to a respected leader in scientific innovation demonstrates how extraordinary circumstances, when met with unwavering moral conviction, can produce contributions to human knowledge and well-being that transcend the limitations of any single lifetime. The laboratory that serves as Kenny's adult workspace represents more than simply a research facility, but rather a temple to the pursuit of knowledge in service of healing the wounds that time and circumstance have inflicted upon human relationships and individual lives. The sophisticated equipment that surrounds him reflects decades of accumulated expertise and financial success that stand in stark contrast to the poverty of his childhood. Yet the underlying motivations that drive his research remain rooted in the same compassionate instincts that characterized his heroic actions as Mysterian. Every experiment he conducts, every theoretical framework he develops, every technological innovation he pursues serves the ultimate goal of using his unique understanding of temporal mechanics to address problems that conventional science considers impossible to solve. The specific focus of Kenny's research into time travel technology reveals the continuing influence of his traumatic childhood experiences and his persistent desire to protect others from unnecessary suffering, even when that protection requires him to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself. His scientific notebooks contain complex equations and theoretical models that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of quantum mechanics, temporal paradox theory, and the practical challenges of creating stable pathways through time without causing catastrophic disruption to the space-time continuum. Yet beneath these technical details lies the emotional core of his research mission, the desperate need to prevent a single moment of thoughtless cruelty from destroying the friendships that gave his difficult life meaning and purpose. The secrecy that surrounds Kenny's time travel project reflects both the inherent dangers of temporal manipulation and his understanding that his friends would never approve of his efforts to interfere with their personal choices and life trajectories, even when those choices led to decades of misery and regret for everyone involved. His decision to pursue this research without consulting Stan, Kyle, or even Cartman demonstrates his evolution into someone who takes responsibility for solving problems regardless of whether others recognize the need for solutions or approve of his methods. This represents the culmination of a lifetime spent protecting others who remained oblivious to their need for protection. The technological challenges that Kenny faces in developing functional time travel capabilities require him to synthesize knowledge from multiple scientific disciplines while pushing beyond the boundaries of conventional physics into theoretical territories that few scientists have ever explored. His research notebooks reveal calculations that bridge quantum mechanics with supernatural phenomena, incorporating his first-hand experience with resurrection and dimensional travel into scientific frameworks that treat these impossible experiences as data points rather than fantasy or delusion. This unique combination of empirical knowledge and supernatural experience creates research advantages that no other scientist could possibly possess. The emotional weight that Kenny carries as he pursues his temporal research reflects the accumulated burden of 40 years spent watching his friends' lives unfold in patterns of disappointment, isolation, and missed opportunities that he believes could have been prevented if their childhood friendship had survived the pressures that eventually tore them apart. His intimate knowledge of how each friend's life developed after their separation gives him unique insight into the specific consequences of their childhood decisions, creating a comprehensive understanding of cause and effect that motivates his determination to change the past, regardless of personal cost or risk. The laboratory journals that document Kenny's progress reveal not only his scientific methodology, but also his emotional journey as he grapples with the ethical implications of temporal intervention and the question of whether anyone has the right to change the past, even with the best of intentions. His private writings demonstrate sophisticated understanding of paradox theory, butterfly effect principles, and the potential for unintended consequences that could result from even minor alterations to historical events. Yet his moral conviction that preventing his friend's suffering justifies the risks creates internal conflicts that drive him toward increasingly desperate and dangerous experimental approaches. The isolation that characterizes Kenny's adult life reflects the continuation of patterns established during his childhood, as his unique experiences and supernatural knowledge create barriers to forming authentic relationships with colleagues and potential romantic partners who cannot comprehend the full scope of his background and motivations. His scientific reputation provides professional respect and social acceptance. Yet, the secrecy required to protect his research and his supernatural history prevents him from achieving the genuine human connections that might have provided emotional support during his most challenging work. This isolation mirrors his childhood experience of being surrounded by people who could not truly understand or appreciate his actual circumstances. The financial resources that Kenny accumulates through his scientific innovations and patents provide him with the means to fund extensive research while also addressing the economic insecurities that defined his childhood experience. Yet these material advantages cannot resolve the deeper emotional needs that drive his temporal research project. His wealth enables him to build sophisticated laboratories, hire research assistants, and purchase cutting-edge equipment, but it cannot purchase the friendship and emotional connection that his time travel research aims to restore. This highlights the fundamental truth that external success cannot compensate for internal loneliness and the loss of meaningful relationships. The health deterioration that eventually leads to Kenny's death reflects the cumulative toll of decades spent balancing supernatural immortality with normal human aging, as his body finally succumbs to the stress of carrying consciousness that has experienced countless deaths while maintaining the biological processes of a single mortal lifetime. The specific circumstances of his death suggest that his temporal research may have accelerated his physical decline, as exposure to experimental energies and dimensional instabilities takes its toll on his cellular structure. His willingness to accept these health risks in pursuit of his research goals demonstrates his continued commitment to self-sacrifice for others' benefit. The discovery of Kenny's research by his former friends creates one of the most emotionally devastating revelations in the entire South Park narrative, as Stan, Kyle, and Cartman finally understand the scope of Kenny's adult achievements and the depth of his commitment to their welfare despite decades of separation and mutual silence. The sophisticated equipment, detailed research notes, and evidence of his scientific reputation forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that the friend they had dismissed as the least significant member of their group had become the most accomplished and dedicated to their collective welfare. This discovery challenges their assumptions about Kenny's capabilities while revealing the extent of their own failure to maintain connection with someone who never stopped caring about their friendship. The temporal research data that Kenny leaves behind reveals not only his scientific methodology, but also his emotional journey through decades of loneliness, professional success, and persistent hope that somehow he could use his unique knowledge and abilities to heal the wounds that time had inflicted on the relationships that mattered most to him. His research logs contain personal entries that document his emotional state during various phases of his work, revealing the depth of his continuing love for friends who had moved on with their lives without maintaining contact or expressing interest in his welfare. These personal records demonstrate that his scientific work was motivated not by abstract intellectual curiosity, but by profound human need for connection and reconciliation. The ethical framework that guides Kenny's research reflects sophisticated moral reasoning about individual agency, collective welfare, and the responsibility that comes with possessing knowledge and capabilities that others cannot understand or replicate. His private writings reveal extensive consideration of whether changing the past violates his friends' autonomy, or whether preventing their suffering represents the highest expression of love and friendship. These philosophical deliberations demonstrate the continuation of the moral sophistication that characterized his childhood heroic actions, now applied to questions of cosmic significance. The technical specifications of Kenny's time travel device reveal engineering solutions that bridge conventional physics with supernatural phenomena, incorporating elements that only someone with his unique experiences could have conceived or implemented. The device represents the culmination of decades of research and development, yet its most crucial components rely on principles that Kenny discovered through his childhood experiences with death and resurrection, rather than through conventional scientific investigation. This synthesis of empirical research with supernatural insight creates technological capabilities that exceed anything that normal scientific methods could have achieved. The activation sequence that Kenny programmed into his time travel device demonstrates his understanding that successful temporal intervention would require precise timing and careful coordination with his past self's decision-making processes, ensuring that changes to the timeline would appear natural rather than forced or artificial. His research notes reveal sophisticated understanding of how memories and personality development interact with environmental influences, enabling him to calculate exactly what interventions would be necessary to preserve his friends' essential characters while preventing the specific conflicts that led to their separation. The paradox resolution protocols that Kenny built into his temporal research reflect his awareness that changing the past could create logical contradictions that might destabilize reality itself, requiring safeguards and correction mechanisms that could maintain causal consistency while achieving his desired outcomes. His engineering solutions demonstrate remarkable creativity in addressing theoretical problems that exist at the intersection of physics and philosophy, creating practical applications for concepts that most scientists consider purely speculative. The backup systems and fail-safe mechanisms that characterize Kenny's time travel technology reveal his continued pattern of self-sacrifice. As he designs the device to ensure his friends' welfare, even if the temporal intervention results in his own non-existence or permanent separation from the timeline he seeks to preserve. His willingness to accept personal obliteration as the cost of his friend's happiness represents the ultimate expression of the selfless love that has motivated his actions throughout his entire existence. The success of Kenny's temporal intervention creates a new timeline where his childhood friends maintain their emotional bonds while developing into healthier, more fulfilled adults whose lives reflect the positive potential that their original timeline had squandered through unnecessary conflict and separation. The Denver Nuggets game that serves as the focal point for their reconciliation represents Kenny's sophisticated understanding of how shared positive experiences can override negative emotional patterns while creating new associations that support continued friendship and mutual support. The ultimate irony of Kenny's achievement lies in the fact that his most successful and meaningful act of heroism occurs posthumously and remains unknown to the friends whose lives he transformed, creating a perfect expression of the selfless service that characterized his entire existence while denying him the recognition and gratitude that his sacrifices deserved. His temporal intervention succeeds completely in achieving its intended goals, while ensuring that Kenny himself receives no benefit or acknowledgement from those he saved, representing the purest possible expression of altruistic love. In the quiet contemplation of Kenny's ultimate sacrifice, we recognize that his entire life trajectory, from his traumatic childhood through his scientific achievements to his final temporal intervention, represents one of fiction's most profound explorations of how individual suffering can be transformed into collective healing through sustained commitment to love and service. His story demonstrates that the most meaningful victories often go unrecognized, that the greatest acts of love occur in silence and secrecy, and that sometimes the highest expression of friendship requires the willingness to sacrifice not just one's life, but one's very existence in the memory of those whose welfare matters more than personal recognition or reward. And so we reach the end of our journey through the extraordinary life of Kenneth McCormick, a boy who taught us that true heroism isn't about having power, but about how you use the power you have. Kenny showed us that poverty cannot diminish dignity, that trauma need not create cruelty, and that love persists even when it goes unrecognized. In a world that often forgot he existed, Kenny never forgot to care for others. His muffled voice carried more wisdom than the clearest speeches, his hidden face more humanity than the most visible heroes. As you drift into sleep, remember Kenny's lesson, that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen in silence, that the most profound sacrifices go unwitnessed, and that true immortality lies not in never dying, but in the goodness we leave behind. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the quiet darkness, there are those who guard and protect, who remember and care, who choose hope despite having every reason for despair. Sleep peacefully and dream of orange parkas and guardian angels.